Good morning, I'm Adam Sexton. In the 1st Congressional District, every Democrat in the race is looking for a way to catch up to and surpass Stefany Shaheen, who's been the frontrunner for several months now. Among all the candidates, Maura Sullivan has once again shown herself to be a prolific fundraiser. She has well over $1 million in her campaign coffers to fuel her push to September and potentially November. Ms. Sullivan is our guest this morning on Close-Up. Thanks for being here, Maura.
Thanks for having me, Adam. It's always great to be back.
So we'll get to the primary contest in a bit, but I want to start with what's going on right now in the Middle East. You're an Iraq War veteran. You know what can be done, but right now what should be done militarily in Iran so the U.S. can say, we won?
Well, I appreciate the question and the chance to talk about this. You know, as an Iraq War veteran and former Marine Corps officer, I have a lot of experience in the Middle East and spent a lot of time there as a senior Pentagon official when I was appointed by President Obama. Let's be clear, Adam, that this war is illegal. It was unauthorized via Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution. The president has yet to make clear what the objective is in Iran, and he's yet to make clear what the plan is to get out. And I've seen firsthand the devastating and deadly consequences of when we get involved in a war in the Middle East without a clear objective and a plan to win. And that's not okay. This war is not affordable. It's making, gas prices expensive here at home. If I were in Congress right now, I would have voted with Democrats in Congress this week on the War Powers Resolution to take power back rightfully for the Congress and declaring and authorizing war. And I'm very disappointed to see that that didn't pass. I also would not, to be clear, fund another dime for this war unless and until the president comes to Congress, makes clear what his objective is, what success looks like, and frankly, gets authorization.
Having been boots on the ground, there's a real implication to that. You can say we would not fund this any further, but you've been there. What would that have been like as a Marine in Fallujah if you heard the Democrats back in Washington were suddenly taking away that supply chain from you?
Well, I don't believe that's what it is. I think one of the most patriotic things that we can do and one of the most solemn duties of a member of Congress is to take incredibly seriously the vote to authorize military force. Not only is it Article 1, Section 8, not only is it the law, but it's also incredibly important. And here's why. Members of Congress need to be able to go back to their districts and look people in the eye, look their constituents in the eye, and say why they sent their mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, sisters, and brothers to a war in the Middle East. That is incredibly, incredibly important. Let's be clear also who these young men and women are who go and fight these wars. It's not the sons and daughters of senators and CEOs. It's kids from working families, kids who just enlisted out of Central High School right here in Manchester, enlisted out of Kennett High School in North Conway. That's who's going over to fight these wars, and members of Congress have to be able to look their constituents in the eye and say why this is necessary.
And yet the political implications, right? There's the constitutional obligation, but if you do something like that, if you do vote to take the funding away, it opens the door politically for the president to say essentially, well, we would have won if the Democrats hadn't taken the funding away and abandoned our troops in the field. Like, how would you respond to that?
I think for something this serious, something like that shouldn't be a consideration. You're talking about life and death for the people of New Hampshire and people all around the country. That is one of the most solemn votes that you would take. I am always going to make sure that our troops have the training and resources that they need to succeed. And that is a separate issue than funding a war. And frankly, I have the credibility as an Iraq War veteran, as a former Marine Corps captain, and as a former senior Pentagon official to speak truth to power and to stand up to our president if he tries to use that as an excuse. And no one's ever going to accuse me, Adam, of not supporting our troops.
Israel is obviously a parallel aspect of what's going on here. Senators Shaheen and Hassan just voted against arms sales to Israel. There were 40 out of 47 Senate Democrats, I believe, who voted along with them. Did they do the right thing with that vote?
I stand with our senators, and I would have voted with them. Let's be clear as to what that vote was about. This was about giving Israel weapons to further a war with Iran, a war that is illegal, it's unnecessary, we can't afford it. It's costing us so much here at home, rising gas prices. And as an Iraq War veteran, I have seen, the devastating consequences of when that happens, when we go to wars in the Middle East without a clear objective, a plan to win, and a plan for the day after. And I've seen the 18 and 19-year-old men and women that pay the price for that. And an entire generation of us, Iraq War veterans, swore we would never let that happen again to another generation of American kids. So I will not support another dime for this war or anything that furthers it.
The relationship with Israel, where do you draw the line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism? And this seems like it's going to be a very important question for your party moving forward, because there are a lot of young people who are coming into the Democratic Party who seem to have a profound antipathy for Israel.
Yeah, Israel is one of our closest allies. It's our only democratic ally in the Middle East. And as someone who has spent considerable time in the Middle East, and I'm sure I'm the only candidate in my race that has, I fought in a war in the Middle East. I spent significant time in the Middle East as a senior Pentagon official, meeting with military leaders, meeting with world leaders. So I speak about this from a lot of experience. That relationship, us with Israel, is critical to the national security of the United States. And I think an important distinction here is that we always stand by the people of Israel, just as I would hope that our allies would stand by the people of the United States, regardless of the disagreements that they may have with our reckless and unhinged president. We need to stand by the people of Israel and make sure that they are safe and secure due to the extreme terrorist threat that surrounds them in the region.
Let's move to your primary in the 1st Congressional District. You are once again kind of blowing the doors off on the fundraising aspect of this, but how are we going to see you use that over the next few months? Because we're not, you know, September's far away, but it's close in the sense that the dynamic of the race, you need to change it if you're going to win.
Sure. Well, first of all, let's just kind of be clear what's going on here. My opponent is leading in the polls, and of course she's leading in the polls. Her last name is Shaheen. Her mother has been on the ballot in our state for, I think, close to 36 years, literally like a couple years after the end of the Reagan administration. So of course that's the case. But here's how we're going to win. You know, polls are an indication, early polls, of one thing and one thing only, which is name ID. We are going to have the resources to raise my name ID and close that name ID gap, and then also, and additionally, have people the time and opportunity to get to know me. And what we're hearing on the campaign trail is that when people have the chance to get to know me, that they are excited and they're compelled by what our campaign offers, which is a different kind of leadership. Leadership rooted in a lifelong commitment to service, to having the experience in Washington as a senior Pentagon official and having been trusted by President Obama, as well as someone who, you know, is just one of us, is a regular person. You know, I was a public school kid. I don't come from a wealthy or well-connected family. I got a scholarship to go to college, ROTC scholarship, and then I worked 3 jobs, including waiting tables to pay for my room and board at school, and then I joined the Marines, and that was hard, and I struggled. Years later, when I went to finish my education, I took out hundreds of thousands of dollars of student loans. So when I talk to people around our district who are wondering, like, how do I afford an education for my kids? Like, how am I going to pay rent? That's something where I've walked a mile in those shoes, and I think people are looking for a different kind of leadership right now.
Stefany Shaheen was here last week, and we discussed the donation that she received from the corporate PAC of Sig Sauer, a major firearms manufacturer with facilities here in the district. What did you make of her answer that she said she didn't solicit that donation?
Candidly, I didn't watch I did not watch her appearance, so I can't comment on that specifically. What I can say is that corporate PAC checks don't just fall out of the sky. They have to be asked for. And I can also just say that, you know, I don't take any corporate PAC money on my campaign, never have, never will. And in fact, I released an anti-corruption platform. I was the first candidate in this race to release one. Other candidates have since released an anti-corruption platform. You'll note that it's closely modeled after mine. But one of the first things it calls for is banning corporate PAC money in politics, because we have to get the influence of corporations out of politics. And that's one of the things that, you know, Congress needs to pass. My anti-corruption platform also calls for overturning Citizens United, banning members of Congress from being able to trade individual stocks, and closing the revolving door between the administration and employers and corporations so that members of the executive branch cannot use privileged information to enrich their previous or former employer.
On the donor front, your campaign has taken incoming from your opponents regarding the source of some of your campaign cash. They've taken issue with several $1,000s in donations from individuals who work at Palantir, which is the company that sort of operates the software for ICE in this mass deportation effort. What's your response to that that criticism?
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. And let me be clear, I have never taken corporate PAC money, and I never will. I did not take any contribution from Palantir. The contributions that you are referring to were two individual contributions, one from a former senior colleague of mine in the Obama administration who was appointed by President Obama, and the other one from a friend who is the godfather of one of my children. I'm really proud to have their support, but to be clear, I haven't taken any money from Palantir. I will never take any corporate PAC money or money from any ICE vendor.
What do you say, though, to those who would say accepting that money is a tacit approval of what Palantir does to assist in mass deportation?
I would just reject the premise of that. I'm really proud to have the support of people that were trusted by President Obama, and I'm really proud to have the support of lifelong friends of mine and my husband's who play a role in our extended family and are the godfather of my son.
And one other question for you, sort of in this front of the questions that opponents have. You're also the first vice chair of the party. On the Republican side, Holly Novoletsky was vice chair and decided to step down, and you've remained in your role. Why is that?
I'm really focused on what I hear from all Granite Staters and not just Democrats about preserving, protecting, and defending our first-in-the-nation primary. I'm actively at work on that. It's really, really important to people, and I want to continue, as long as I can add value, I want to continue working to preserve our first-in-the-nation primary. All
right, Maura Sullivan, we've run out of time for now, but we'll have you back here again in a few months. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Okay, and we'll be right back with the Democrat trying to unseat Congresswoman Maggie Goodlander in the 2nd Congressional District. Stay with us.